No one expected this. Sam Rockwell fires back at Whoopi Goldberg, and the entire studio goes silent. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? One that no one in the studio quite anticipates, but everyone suddenly feels. Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice, and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. The segment begins the way many daytime talk show interviews do: calm, welcoming, and easygoing. The host introduces Sam Rockwell with a warm smile, setting a relaxed tone as the audience applauds. He walks out, gives a quick wave, exchanges greetings, and takes his seat at the table. From the start, his body language is open but measured. He leans slightly forward, hands loosely clasped, clearly ready for a conversation but not overly animated. The panel starts with familiar ground. They talk about his latest project, his approach to acting, and how he prepares for roles. The questions are light, conversational, and designed to ease both the guest and the audience into the segment. Sam responds thoughtfully, occasionally adding a bit of humor, which gets a few soft laughs from the audience. His tone is steady, conversational, nothing rushed or overly polished. As the conversation continues, Sunny Hostin begins to guide the discussion in a slightly different direction. Her posture shifts subtly. She straightens, her expression becoming more focused. It's not abrupt, but it's noticeable enough to signal a transition from casual conversation to something more serious. She references a broader topic connected to Sam's recent work, something with social or cultural implications. At first, Sam listens attentively, nodding as she speaks. His expression remains neutral, though there's a slight tightening around his eyes, suggesting he's processing the direction the conversation is taking. Sunny poses her question carefully, framing it in a way that connects his work to a larger societal issue. It's the kind of question that invites reflection but also carries an expectation of accountability. There's a brief pause after she finishes speaking. It's not uncomfortable, but it's longer than the usual rhythm of the conversation up to that point. Sam takes a moment before answering, glancing briefly at the other pain lists before returning his focus to Sunny. When he responds, his tone is calm but more deliberate than before. He begins by acknowledging the complexity of the issue, choosing his words carefully. He explains his perspective as an actor, emphasizing that his role is often to portray characters rather than make direct statements. His voice remains steady, but there's a noticeable firmness in how he articulates his point. He's not dismissive, but he's clearly setting a boundary around how he sees his work. Sunny listens closely, maintaining eye contact. As he speaks, she nods slightly, but her expression suggests she's preparing a follow-up. The rest of the panel remains quiet, allowing the exchange to unfold without interruption. The audience, too, is noticeably still, sensing that the tone of the segment has shifted. When Sam finishes his initial response, Sunny follows up almost immediately. Her tone remains professional, but there's a subtle increase in intensity. She reframes the question, pressing a bit further, asking whether public figures, especially those involved in projects that touch on sensitive topics, have a responsibility to engage more directly with the issues those projects raise. This is the moment where the conversation begins to feel more like a disagreement than a discussion. Sam leans back slightly in his chair, his posture changing from open to more guarded. He exhales quietly before responding again. His expression is composed, but there's a clear sense that he's choosing his words with greater precision now. He responds firmly this time, reiterating that while he respects the importance of the issues being discussed, he doesn't believe it's his role to speak as an authority on them simply because of a role he played. His tone is still calm, but there's a noticeable edge, an emphasis on certain words that signals his drawing a line. The shift doesn't go unnoticed. One of the other hosts glances between Sam and Sunny, her expression neutral but attentive. Another leans slightly forward, as if considering whether to step in, but ultimately remains silent. The focus stays squarely on the exchange between Sam and Sunny. Sunny responds again, her voice steady but more pointed now. She acknowledges his perspective but suggests that visibility comes with influence, and influence often comes with responsibility. It's not confrontational in an aggressive sense, but it's direct. She's clearly challenging his stance, asking him to consider a broader view. At this point, the rhythm of the conversation has slowed significantly. Each response is followed by a brief pause, as if both are carefully measuring their words. The audience remains quiet, with only occasional murmurs or soft reactions when a point lands particularly strongly. Sam's next response is where his firmness becomes most apparent. He leans slightly forward again, meeting Sunny's gaze directly. His voice remains controlled, but there's a clarity and confidence that wasn't as pronounced earlier in the segment. He explains that he believes meaningful conversations about these issues should be led by those with direct experience or expertise, rather than actors who are interpreting roles. He's not dismissing the importance of the topic. In fact, he emphasizes that it matters, but he's drawing a distinction between representation and authority. His delivery is measured, but the conviction behind his words is clear. Sunny listens without interrupting, her expression thoughtful but still serious. When he finishes, there's another brief pause. It's the kind of pause that often happens on live television when a conversation reaches a point where both sides have clearly stated their positions. The tension isn't dramatic or explosive, but it's unmistakable. It's the kind of tension that comes from two people engaging sincerely but seeing things differently. The rest of the panel remains quiet, allowing the moment to breathe rather than rushing to fill it. One of the co-hosts eventually steps in, her tone lighter, attempting to broaden the conversation slightly. She asks a related question that gives Sam an opportunity to expand on his thoughts without directly continuing the back and forth. It's a subtle shift, but it helps ease the intensity just a bit. Sam responds, his tone softening slightly as the focus widens. He speaks about collaboration, about listening, and about the importance of dialogue. It's clear he's not trying to shut down the conversation. He's just defining his place within it. Sunny nods as he speaks, and while she doesn't fully step back from her position, her demeanor becomes less pointed. The exchange begins to settle into a more balanced discussion, though the earlier tension still lingers beneath the surface. As the segment continues, the conversation moves into related areas, but the earlier disagreement remains the central moment. It's the part that the audience is most engaged with, the part that feels unscripted and real. From a viewer's perspective, it's a reminder of how quickly a live television conversation can shift. What begins as a routine interview can become something more layered, more complex, simply because of a single question and the way it's answered. And in this case, it's not about who was right or wrong. It's about how both participants handled the moment, calmly, respectfully, but with clear conviction. It's the kind of exchange that doesn't rely on raised voices or dramatic gestures, but instead on tone, timing, and the weight of the words being spoken. As the segment approaches its midpoint, the atmosphere in the studio feels different from how it began. Still professional, still controlled, but more thoughtful, more attentive. The audience, the panel, and even Sam himself seem more aware of the significance of what's being discussed. And while the conversation has begun to move forward, there's a sense that the core disagreement hasn't fully resolved. It's simply been acknowledged, set in place, and left for the audience to consider as the discussion continues. As the conversation continues, there's a noticeable shift in how carefully each person at the table is choosing their words. The earlier exchange between Sam Rockwell and Sunny Hostin hasn't disappeared. It lingers just beneath the surface, shaping the tone of everything that follows. Even as the discussion broadens, there's a sense that both of them are still aware of that moment, still adjusting their responses with it in mind. The next question comes from another co-host, and it's delivered in a way that feels intentionally neutral. She pivots slightly back toward Sam's work, asking about the collaborative process on set and how different perspectives come together during production. It's the kind of question that offers a reset without directly addressing the tension, and for a moment, the atmosphere lightens. Sam responds in a more relaxed tone than before. He speaks about directors, writers, and fellow actors, describing how each contributes to shaping a story. His hands move a bit more as he talks now, his posture loosening slightly. The audience responds with a few soft nods and quiet reactions, clearly following along. It feels, briefly, like the segment has found its rhythm again. But then, as often happens in live television conversations, the earlier topic finds its way back in, this time from a slightly different angle. Sunny leans in again, not interrupting but waiting for a natural pause. When she speaks, her tone is measured, but there's a renewed focus in her expression. She references something Sam just said about collaboration and gently connects it back to the earlier discussion. Her question isn't confrontational, but it's clearly intentional. She asks whether collaboration also means engaging with the broader impact of a story once it reaches audiences. There's a subtle shift in the room again. It's not as sharp as before, but it's noticeable. Sam's expression tightens slightly, not in frustration, but in concentration. He nods once, acknowledging the question, and takes a brief pause before answering. This time, his response is more layered. He doesn't immediately draw a boundary the way he did earlier. Instead, he starts by agreeing with part of her point. He acknowledges that stories can have an impact beyond entertainment and that audiences often connect deeply with what they see on screen. His tone is thoughtful, and there's a sense that he's trying to meet the question halfway. But then he carefully adds his perspective again. He explains that while he respects that impact, he believes there's a difference between contributing to a story and being expected to represent or speak for the issues within it. His voice remains steady, but there's a quiet firmness underneath it. It's not a rejection of the idea, more a clarification of where he stands. Sunny listens closely, her head slightly tilted as she processes his response. She doesn't jump in right away this time. Instead, there's a brief pause, giving the moment space. The audience remains attentive, the kind of quiet that signals they are fully engaged rather than uncertain. When Sunny responds, her tone is slightly softer than before, but still direct. She acknowledges what Sam is saying, but she offers a different perspective. She points out that audiences don't always separate the actor from the work as cleanly as he's describing. In her view, visibility naturally brings a level of influence, whether it's intentional or not. The exchange, at this point, feels less like a disagreement and more like a careful negotiation of ideas. Neither of them is raising their voice, and neither is interrupting. But there's a clear contrast in how they see the issue, and both are holding their ground in a calm, controlled way. One of the co-hosts steps in briefly, adding her own perspective. She frames it as a broader question about public figures in general, rather than focusing solely on Sam. Her tone is conversational, and she gestures lightly with her hands as she speaks, trying to widen the discussion and bring in additional viewpoints. This helps diffuse the focus slightly. Sam nods as she speaks, and when it's his turn to respond, his tone softens again. He agrees that public figures can have influence and that many choose to use it in meaningful ways. He's careful to emphasize that he respects those choices, even if he approaches things differently himself. There's a noticeable shift in the audience at this point. A few people nod, and there's a small ripple of quiet agreement, not applause, but a subtle acknowledgement. It's the kind of reaction that suggests the conversation is resonating, even if it's not producing a clear consensus. Sunny, however, isn't entirely finished with the point. She leans forward slightly, her expression thoughtful but still focused. She asks one more question, this time more specific. She brings up a moment from one of Sam's recent roles, referencing a scene that had sparked conversation among viewers. Her question is whether he had reflected on how that scene might be interpreted in the context of current social discussions. It's a precise question, and it brings the conversation back to a very concrete example. Sam's reaction is subtle but noticeable. He pauses again, this time a bit longer than before. His eyes shift briefly downward, then back up, as if he's organizing his thoughts. When he answers, his tone is calm but distinctly firm again. He explains that while he's aware of how audiences might interpret certain scenes, his primary focus during the work is on the character and the story as it's written. He adds that interpretation is ultimately something that belongs to the audience, not something he feels he can or should control. There's no defensiveness in his voice, but there's clarity. It's the clearest statement yet of how he views his role, and it lands with a certain finality. Sunny nods slowly as he speaks, her expression thoughtful. She doesn't immediately counter his response this time. Instead, she lets it sit for a moment, allowing the audience to absorb what is said. The room feels balanced again, but not entirely settled. There's still a quiet tension, not uncomfortable, but present. It's the kind of atmosphere that comes from a meaningful conversation rather than a resolved one. Another co-host steps in again, this time with a slightly lighter tone. She makes a brief comment about how these kinds of discussions are exactly what make live television interesting. It draws a small, appreciative reaction from the audience, some light laughter, a few nods. Sam smiles briefly at that, the first more visible sign of ease since the earlier exchange. It's a small moment, but it helps shift the energy just enough to keep the conversation moving. From there, the discussion begins to branch out again, touching on related topics but with a broader scope. The earlier tension doesn't disappear, but it becomes part of the overall conversation rather than its sole focus. Sunny remains engaged, but her tone becomes more conversational again. She asks a follow-up that feels less pointed, more exploratory. Sam responds in kind, and the back and forth becomes smoother, more fluid. Still, for anyone watching closely, the earlier exchange continues to shape how both of them communicate. There's a heightened awareness in their pacing, a carefulness in their phrasing. It's not something that dominates the segment, but it's there in the background. The audience, too, seems more attentive than at the start. There's less casual movement, fewer scattered reactions. People are listening closely, following the nuances of the conversation rather than just the surface. As the segment moves forward, it becomes clear that what started as a routine interview has turned into something more layered. Not dramatic, not confrontational in the usual sense, but thoughtful and, at times, quietly intense. And while the discussion continues to evolve, the central dynamic between Sam Rockwell and Sunny Hostin remains the anchor. It's a dynamic built on mutual respect, but also on a clear difference in perspective, one that neither of them is trying to hide or soften completely. By this point, the conversation has found a kind of balance. The tension is no longer escalating, but it hasn't fully resolved either. Instead, it's become part of the rhythm of the segment, shaping how each new question is asked and answered. For viewers at home, it's the kind of moment that stands out, not because of raised voices or dramatic gestures, but because of its authenticity. It feels unscripted, real, and reflective of the kinds of conversations people are having outside the studio as well. And as the discussion continues to unfold, there's a sense that the most important part isn't about reaching agreement, but about allowing both perspectives to be heard clearly, without interruption, and without being reduced to something simpler than they actually are. As the segment continues, there's a noticeable steadiness that settles over the table, but it's not the same relaxed ease from the beginning. It's more focused now, more intentional. The earlier exchange has clearly shaped the tone, and everyone, both on the panel and in the audience, seems more attentive to the direction each question might take. The conversation shifts again, this time toward how actors navigate public expectations more broadly. One of the co-hosts introduces the topic by referencing how audiences today often look beyond performances and expect insight into personal beliefs. Her tone is neutral, but the question itself naturally connects back to the discussion between Sam Rockwell and Sunny Hostin. Sam listens carefully, his posture upright, hands resting lightly on the table. He nods once as the question is framed, signaling he understands where it's going. When he begins to answer, his tone is calm and reflective. He talks about the changing landscape of public attention, how social media and constant visibility have blurred the line between professional work and personal voice. As he speaks, there's a sense that he's trying to explain rather than defend. He acknowledges that audiences are more engaged than ever, more curious, and sometimes more demanding. But he also points out that not everyone approaches that visibility in the same way. His voice remains even, and his pacing is measured, as if he's deliberately keeping the conversation grounded. Sunny watches him closely, her expression thoughtful rather than challenging at this point. She doesn't interrupt, but there's a subtle shift in her posture, leaning slightly forward, hands folded, clearly preparing to respond once he finishes. When Sam wraps up his point, another brief pause follows. It's become a pattern now, these small moments of silence that allow each statement to settle before the next begins. They are not uncomfortable, but they do carry weight. Sunny then speaks, her tone calm but purposeful. She acknowledges what Sam has said about visibility, but she adds another layer to it. She talks about how, from her perspective, public platforms come with opportunities, not just pressures. Her voice is steady, and her delivery is careful, as if she's trying to build on the conversation rather than redirect it abruptly. She explains that for many viewers, especially those who feel represented or impacted by certain stories, hearing directly from actors can feel meaningful. It's not framed as an obligation, but as a chance to connect more deeply with audiences. As she speaks, she maintains eye contact with Sam, but her tone remains measured and respectful. Sam nods as she talks, showing that he's listening. When she finishes, he doesn't respond immediately. Instead, he takes a small breath and shifts slightly in his seat. It's a subtle movement, but it suggests he's considering how to respond carefully. When he does speak, there's a noticeable clarity in his voice. He agrees that connection with audiences is important, and that storytelling can create meaningful conversations. But he gently returns to his earlier point, emphasizing that those conversations don't always need to be led by the actors themselves. His tone is firm, but not dismissive. He explains that he sees his role as contributing to the story, while others, writers, directors, experts, and even viewers, bring their own interpretations and insights to it. There's a sense that he's trying to broaden the idea of who gets to lead these discussions. At this point, the exchange feels more balanced than before. It's still a difference in perspective, but it's no longer building in intensity. Instead, it's settling into a rhythm of thoughtful disagreement. One of the co-hosts adds her perspective again, this time sharing a personal observation about how audiences often respond to performances. Her tone is conversational, and she gestures lightly as she speaks. She mentions how certain roles can spark conversations in unexpected ways, even beyond what the creators might have intended. This comment seems to resonate with both Sam and Sunny. Sam nods in agreement, and Sunny offers a small smile, acknowledging the point. For a moment, there's a shared understanding at the table, a recognition that the relationship between art and audience is complex. The audience reacts subtly, some nodding, a few quiet murmurs of agreement. It's not a loud reaction, but it's engaged. People are clearly following the conversation closely. The discussion then takes a slightly more personal turn. Another host asks Sam how he handles moments when his work is interpreted in ways he didn't expect. It's a question that feels more reflective than challenging, and it gives him an opportunity to speak from experience rather than position. Sam's response is thoughtful. He explains that he's learned to accept that once a project is released, it no longer belongs solely to the people who made it. He talks about how different viewers bring different perspectives, and how that can lead to a wide range of interpretations. As he speaks, his tone softens slightly. There's less of the firmness from earlier and more openness. He even offers a small, self-aware smile at one point, acknowledging that he's been surprised by audience reactions in the past. Sunny listens attentively, and this time, when she responds, her tone is noticeably warmer. She builds on his point, talking about how those varied interpretations can lead to important conversations, even if they are not always comfortable. There's a sense now that the conversation is evolving. The earlier tension hasn't disappeared entirely, but it's no longer at the forefront. Instead, it's been integrated into a broader, more nuanced discussion. Still, there are moments where the difference in perspective becomes visible again. When the topic circles back to responsibility, whether direct or indirect, Sam's responses become slightly more deliberate. His phrasing tightens, his tone firms just a bit, as if he's reinforcing his stance without restating it entirely. Sunny, in turn, remains consistent in her approach. She doesn't push as directly as she did earlier, but she continues to highlight the importance of engagement and awareness. It's less about challenging him now and more about presenting her perspective clearly. The rest of the panel plays a key role in maintaining this balance. They step in at the right moments, adding context, sharing observations, and occasionally lightening the tone just enough to keep the conversation from becoming too narrow or repetitive. One host makes a brief, light-hearted comment about how these kinds of discussions often continue long after the cameras stop rolling. It draws a small laugh from the audience and a faint smile from Sam, easing the atmosphere slightly. But even with those lighter moments, the conversation remains grounded. There's no attempt to gloss over the differences or rush to a resolution. Instead, it continues at a steady pace, allowing each perspective to be explored without pressure. From a viewer's standpoint, this part of the segment feels more reflective than tense. It's less about the initial disagreement and more about understanding the nuances behind it. Both Sam and Sunny are clearly engaged, but neither is trying to dominate the conversation. As the segment moves further along, there's a growing sense of mutual respect. It's visible in the way they listen to each other, in the pauses they allow, and in the way they respond without interrupting. At the same time, the core difference remains. Sam continues to emphasize his role as an actor focused on storytelling, while Sunny continues to highlight the broader impact of visibility and influence. Neither perspective is presented as definitive, but both are clearly articulated. The audience remains attentive, the studio quiet except for occasional reactions. It's the kind of quiet that indicates focus rather than uncertainty, a sign that the conversation has fully captured attention. And as this part of the discussion unfolds, it becomes clear that what started as a simple interview has turned into something more meaningful. Not because of any dramatic escalation, but because of the willingness on both sides to engage thoughtfully, even when they don't fully agree. The segment continues, moving gradually toward its later stages, with the conversation still evolving, still shaped by that earlier moment, but no longer defined by it alone. As the conversation moves further along, there's a quiet sense that the segment is entering its final stretch, but without any rush to wrap things up. The tone remains steady, and the pacing feels deliberate, as if everyone at the table understands that the discussion has taken on a more thoughtful direction than originally planned. At this point, the hosts begin to explore how conversations like this one unfold beyond the studio. One of the co-hosts brings up the idea of public reaction, how viewers often respond in real time through social media, forming opinions while the discussion is still happening. Her tone is conversational, but the topic naturally invites reflection from both Sam Rockwell and Sunny Hostin. Sam listens, his posture relaxed but attentive. When he responds, he acknowledges that public reaction has become an immediate part of the process. He speaks about how quickly opinions can form and spread, and how that can sometimes create pressure to respond or clarify positions in ways that didn't exist before. His tone is calm, but there's a hint of realism in how he describes it, not critical, but aware of the challenges that come with that level of visibility. He emphasizes that while feedback can be valuable, it can also shift the focus away from the work itself and toward individual interpretation. Sunny follows that point with her own perspective. She agrees that public reaction can be intense, but she frames it slightly differently. She points out that for many viewers, especially those who feel personally connected to certain topics, those reactions are part of a larger conversation that extends beyond entertainment. Her delivery is steady, and she speaks with a sense of clarity that suggests she's drawing from both professional and personal experience. She doesn't directly challenge Sam here, but she subtly reinforces her earlier position, that engagement with audiences, even after the fact, can carry meaning. The exchange feels more aligned in tone now, even if the perspectives still differ. There's less tension in the delivery, more of a conversational rhythm. Both are building on each other's points rather than pushing against them. One of the other hosts steps in with a question that brings the focus back to the in-studio dynamic. She asks how both Sam and Sunny approach conversations when they know they might not agree. It's a reflective question, and it shifts the discussion from the topic itself to the process of communication. Sunny answers first. She explains that for her, it's about listening as much as speaking, about understanding where the other person is coming from, even if she doesn't share the same view. Her tone is calm, and there's a slight softening in her expression as she speaks. As she talks, she briefly glances towards Sam, not in a confrontational way, but as a natural acknowledgement of the conversation they've just had. It's a small moment, but it reflects the mutual awareness that's developed between them. Sam responds next, and his answer mirrors that sense of reflection. He talks about the importance of staying grounded in your own perspective while remaining open to others. He mentions that disagreements don't have to be resolved immediately to be meaningful, that sometimes the value is simply in having the conversation. His tone is steady, and there's a noticeable ease in how he speaks now compared to earlier in the segment. The firmness is still there when he expresses his views, but it's balanced by a more relaxed delivery. The audience reacts quietly to this exchange, some nodding, a few soft murmurs. It's not a moment that draws applause, but it resonates in a quieter way. From there, the conversation shifts slightly toward how media platforms handle discussions like this. One host mentions how live television, in particular, creates a space where these exchanges happen in real time, without the opportunity for editing or revision. This leads to a brief reflection from both Sam and Sunny about the nature of live conversations. Sam notes that there's something valuable about the immediacy, that it allows for genuine reactions rather than carefully crafted statements. Sunny agrees, adding that it also requires a certain level of responsibility in how things are said, given the wide audience. There's a shared understanding in this part of the discussion. Both perspectives align more closely here, and the tone becomes more unified. It's one of the first moments in the segment where there's a clear sense of agreement rather than contrast. The hosts pick up on that shift and allow it to continue. Another co-host adds a light comment about how viewers at home often appreciate seeing these kinds of real, unscripted moments. It draws a small laugh from the audience and a brief smile from both Sam and Sunny. Even with that lighter moment, the conversation remains grounded. There's no attempt to turn it into something overly casual or dismiss the earlier discussion. Instead, it feels like a natural progression, moving from disagreement to reflection. As the segment approaches its final minutes, the questions become slightly more general again, giving Sam space to speak about his work without the same level of scrutiny as before. He talks about upcoming projects, the creative process, and what continues to draw him to certain roles. His tone is relaxed, and there's a noticeable return to the kind of conversational ease that marked the beginning of the segment. The audience responds more openly here, light laughter, a few scattered claps, a sense of familiarity returning. Sunny remains engaged, but her questions now feel more in line with the rest of the panel. The earlier intensity has softened, replaced by a more balanced, conversational approach. She still listens closely, still nods thoughtfully, but there's no longer the same sense of pressing a point. At the same time, the earlier exchange hasn't been forgotten. It lingers in the background, shaping how the conversation is understood, even if it's no longer being directly addressed. One of the final questions brings the discussion back to the audience in a subtle way. A host asks Sam what he hopes people take away from his work, not in terms of specific messages, but in terms of overall experience. Sam's answer is simple but thoughtful. He says he hopes people feel something genuine, whether that's connection, curiosity, or even discomfort. He emphasizes that storytelling, at its core, is about creating moments that resonate in different ways for different people. As he speaks, there's a sense that this answer quietly ties back to the earlier conversation without directly referencing it. It acknowledges the idea of impact while still staying within his perspective as an actor. Sunny nods as he finishes, her expression calm. There's no follow-up challenge this time, just a brief acknowledgement. It's a subtle signal that the conversation has reached a natural point of closure. The hosts begin to transition toward wrapping up the segment. Their tone shifts slightly, still conversational, but with the familiar cues of a show moving to its next portion. There are a few closing remarks, a quick mention of Sam's latest project, and a final moment of light interaction. The audience applauds, a bit more energetically now, signaling appreciation not just for the guest but for the conversation as a whole. It's not the loudest reaction of the show, but it's steady and sustained. As the applause continues, the camera captures a final moment at the table, Sam and Sunny exchanging a brief look and a small, polite smile. It's not exaggerated, but it's meaningful. It reflects the tone that ultimately defined the segment, respectful, engaged, and grounded in genuine conversation. And as the segment comes to a close, there's a sense that while not every point was resolved, the discussion itself was the purpose, something real, measured, and reflective of how these conversations unfold not just on television, but in everyday life as well. As the segment comes to a close, the transition feels smooth but deliberate, the kind that regular viewers recognize immediately. The hosts begin shifting their posture slightly, turning their attention from the depth of the conversation back toward the structure of the show. There's a brief exchange of closing remarks, and the tone becomes lighter, though not disconnected from what just took place. Sam Rockwell offers a final thank you to the panel, his voice relaxed, his expression composed. There's a sense that he's fully aware of how the conversation unfolded, but also comfortable with where it landed. He doesn't revisit any of the earlier points directly. Instead, he keeps his closing comments simple and appreciative, acknowledging the opportunity to talk not just about his work, but about the broader ideas that came up along the way. Sunny Hostin responds with a polite nod and a brief closing remark of her own. Her tone is calm and even, consistent with how she carried herself throughout the segment. There's no lingering tension in her delivery, just a professional wrap-up that reflects the tone she maintained, even during the more focused moments of the discussion. The other co-hosts add a few final comments, bringing the energy back to a more typical daytime rhythm. One mentions Sam's upcoming project again, another offers a light remark that draws a small laugh from the audience. It's a gentle reset, signaling that while the conversation was meaningful, the show itself is continuing. The audience applause builds gradually, filling the studio with a steady, appreciative sound. It's not a reaction to a single moment, but to the segment as a whole. People clap, some nodding as they look toward the stage, reflecting on what they've just watched. It's the kind of response that suggests engagement rather than spectacle. As the cameras begin to pull back slightly, capturing a wider view of the table and the audience, there's a final visual moment that stands out. Sam and Sunny exchange a brief, courteous acknowledgement, nothing dramatic, just a small nod and a faint smile. It's subtle, but it reinforces the tone that ultimately defined their interaction, respectful even when perspectives differed. From a viewer's perspective at home, the segment doesn't feel like it ends abruptly. Instead, it tapers off in a way that allows the conversation to linger. There's no clear winner of the exchange, no definitive conclusion to the ideas that were discussed. And that's part of what makes it feel real. Once the show moves on to the next segment, the immediate focus shifts, but the earlier discussion doesn't disappear. For many viewers, it becomes the part of the episode that stays with them, the moment that prompts reflection or even conversation of their own. Not long after the broadcast, clips of the exchange begin to circulate online. Short segments highlighting key moments, particularly the back and forth between Sam Rockwell and Sunny Hostin, start appearing across social platforms. Viewers begin sharing their reactions, often focusing on the tone of the discussion as much as the content itself. Some viewers express appreciation for how calmly both handled the disagreement. Comments highlight the fact that neither side raised their voice or interrupted, pointing out how rare it can feel to see a disagreement unfold with that level of composure on live television. Others focus on the substance of what was said. Some align more closely with Sam's perspective, agreeing with his view that actors should primarily focus on their craft and leave broader interpretations open to audiences and experts. They describe his responses as measured and clear, emphasizing that he stayed consistent without becoming dismissive. At the same time, many viewers express support for Sunny's position, noting that her questions reflected a broader expectation that public figures engage with the impact of their work. They highlight her persistence in asking thoughtful follow-ups, framing it as an effort to deepen the conversation rather than challenge for the sake of it. There are also viewers who see value in both perspectives, pointing out that the conversation didn't need a resolution to be meaningful. For them, the exchange itself, calm, grounded, and unscripted, becomes the takeaway. Media outlets and entertainment commentators begin to pick up on the moment as well, often describing it as a measured exchange or a thoughtful on-air discussion. The coverage tends to focus less on conflict and more on the tone, noting how the segment stood out for its balance and realism. In the hours following the broadcast, there are a few follow-up discussions from commentators who analyze the exchange more closely. Some note how the pacing of the conversation allowed both sides to fully express their views. Others point out the role of the other co-hosts in maintaining that balance, stepping in at key moments without overshadowing the central discussion. There's also attention given to how the segment reflects a broader shift in talk show conversations, where interviews are no longer just promotional, but often include more layered, real-time discussions about culture, responsibility, and public perception. By the next day, the moment has settled into the cycle of television highlights, still being discussed, still being shared, but now part of a larger conversation about how these exchanges happen on live TV. From the show's perspective, there's no dramatic follow-up or correction needed. The conversation is left as it was presented, open-ended, respectful, and reflective. In a brief mention during a later segment, one of the hosts references how engaged viewers were with the discussion, thanking the audience for their responses without revisiting the details. For Sam Rockwell, the appearance becomes another example of how live interviews can take unexpected turns. He doesn't issue any extended statement afterward, and there's no indication that he felt the need to clarify his position further. His responses on the show stand on their own, delivered clearly and without ambiguity. Sunny Hostin, likewise, continues her role on the panel without any shift in tone or approach. Her questions during the segment are consistent with her style, thoughtful, direct, and grounded in a broader perspective. There's no sense of controversy, only conversation. For viewers, the lasting impression isn't one of conflict, but of engagement. It's a reminder that not all disagreements need to escalate to be meaningful, and that sometimes the most impactful moments on live television are the ones that feel closest to real life, measured, thoughtful, and open to interpretation. As the full episode continues to circulate, the segment remains a point of interest, not because it was dramatic, but because it was genuine. It reflects the kind of exchange that audiences don't always expect, but often appreciate when it happens. And in the end, that's what defines the moment. Not a headline or a single quote, but the way the conversation unfolded, step by step, response by response, with both participants staying grounded in their perspectives while still allowing space for the other. If you watched that exchange, or if you're hearing about it now, share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.